Welcome to everyone to the sixth Padova Hegel Lecture, organized by the research group on classical German philosophy at the University of Padua, hegelpd, on the occasion of the 20th and 50th anniversary of Hegel's birth. Due to the pandemic emergency, our original schedule had to be completely changed. So what were supposed to be in-person lectures have turned into online lectures, but we really hope to get back to in-person lectures very soon. The sixth lecture will be given by Professor Paul Kottman, who is Professor of Comparative Literature and Chair of Liberal Studies at the New School for Social Research in New York. Paul Kottman is one of the most interesting voices within the current international debate on Hegel's aesthetics. He has published key texts in this area. Among his publications, I will just remind that he is the editor of a very important book, The Art of Hegel's Aesthetics, and the subtitle is Hegelian Philosophy and the Perspectives of Art History, published by Fink in 2017. But Professor Kottman's production is not limited to Hegel. His studies of tragedy and Shakespeare in particular are of the greatest significance. The relationship of philosophy to Shakespeare has been the focus of many publications. Here I merely mention A Politics of Sin, Stanford University Press, 2008, Philosophers on Shakespeare, always for Stanford University Press, 2009, and Tragic Conditions in Shakespeare for Johns Hopkins University Press, 2009. In 2017, he published an important book that we had the opportunity to discuss in Padua, which is titled Love as Human Freedom, published by Stanford University Press in 2017. It is, I think, a deeply Hegelian book in many ways. In his original journey through literature and philosophy, Paul tries to show how love is not simply something that concerns the affective sphere of individuals, but it is instead fundamental at the social level as a whole, the level of generating a full life. Alongside all these, Paul is a very good friend of our research group, and this makes the pleasure of hosting him within the Padova Hegel Lectures even greater. The title of his lecture today is Can Hegel's Philosophy of Art Help Us to Understand Contemporary Visual Culture? After the lecture, there will be the possibility to discuss with Professor Kottman, and it will be possible to do it obviously in English, but also in German and possibly in Italian, since Professor Kottman speaks a splendid Italian. I remember that the lecture will be recorded. I thank Paul very much for being here, and I give him the floor immediately. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Luca. It's really a pleasure to join you on Zoom, and I'm very moved to see my friends from Padova, even in this format, after a very long year. So it's really a pleasure to be here. For the sake of not tiring everyone on Zoom, what I thought I would do is speak for about 30 minutes Normally, there's nothing worse than reading a paper. However, for the sake of linguistic facility, since I realize this is an international audience, what I'll do is I'll read fairly slowly just some pieces of the paper that you already have, so as to give an overview of the main points of the paper that we can then discuss together about 30 minutes from now. So if you have the paper and wish to simply pull it up on your screen, you can follow along. Perhaps that will make it easier to follow my English. So according to the 1828-1829 versions of Hegel's Lectures on Fine Art, the Hyman versions that were published in Germany in 2017, according to this version of the lectures, Hegel holds that seeing and hearing are theoretical senses. Touch, taste, and smell are not theoretical, but rather practical. That is, in Hyman's version, Hegel seems to delineate a contrast between theoretische Sinne and praktische Sinne. Seeing and hearing are theoretical, smell, touch, and taste are practical. On this account, art deals with seeing and hearing exclusively because art is for our theoretical interest. I mentioned this passage at the outset because what I will do is put it aside. I think if this is Hegel's true view is not very interesting. And so I'm going to use the Hotto version of the lectures, which I know are perhaps more corrupt. And so I'm not going to try to convince anyone that the view I'll present is Hegel's true view. Instead, what I want to do is see if I can make available for contemporary discussion an aspect I see in Hotto's version of the Lectures on Fine Art. In Hotto's version, art's reliance on seeing and hearing does not license us to conclude that only seeing and hearing are theoretical senses. Rather, the issue for Hegel is that touch, taste, and smell deal with matter as such in its immediately sensible qualities, and therefore, I'm quoting, they cannot have to do with artistic objects which are meant to maintain themselves in their real independence, end quote. So the important contrast between the senses, therefore, is not pursuant to a division between theoretical and practical senses, nor does Hegel invoke a distinction between the sensuous and the intellectual. Rather, Hegel repeatedly emphasizes that art's theoretical claims are also sensuous claims, and anyway, the theoretical senses of seeing and hearing are themselves entirely sensuous. So the important contrast concerns the way in which art entails an exclusion of touch, taste, and smell. Hegel says, smell, taste, and touch remain excluded from the enjoyment of art. I understand this to mean not that touch, taste, and smell are purely sensuous or merely sensuous or somehow untheoretical. Rather, I understand Hegel to mean they are sensuous and theoretical in ways that don't lend themselves to making art. This means that art's use of the theoretical senses of sight and sound teaches us something about the theoretical dimension of smell, taste, and touch, namely that the latter are excluded from art in a way which is vouchsafed by the fact that these senses, touch, taste, and smell, cannot maintain themselves in their real independence or by making art objects. In sum, and I'm just at the end of section 1 in the paper, while it might seem that whatever theoretical dimension there is to touch, taste, or smell cannot be revealed in our contemplation of art objects, I nevertheless think that the more fruitful conclusion points in the opposite direction. The exclusion of touch, taste, and smell from art objects is revealed in the exclusivity of art's relation to the theoretical senses of seeing and hearing. In this way, the exclusivity of art's relation to seeing and hearing teaches us something about the relationship between seeing and hearing on the one hand, visual culture is what I'm going to focus on today, more than hearing, and touch, taste, and smell on the other, something which art exclusively teaches. So in my remarks, I'm going to completely leave aside taste, smell, and hearing and focus instead on seeing and touch. I want to explore some implications of Hegel's view that the theoretical significance of touch cannot be grasped artistically, but that this is a lesson which art exclusively teaches. It seems to me that Hegel's philosophy of art offers unique resources, maybe even irreplaceable resources, for better understanding our contemporary visual culture and the implications of its obliviousness, or so I'll argue, to the moral and theoretical implications of how human beings are touched or touch one another. I'll give special attention to Hegel's remarks on painting in the first part of my remarks, because this is the art form in which the theoretical sense of seeing is most thoroughly developed in Hegel's view. More precisely, I'll consider Hegel's remarks on Christian painting, and especially Hegel's, I think, rather astonishing claim that maternal love is the proper content of Christian painting and of painting in general, perhaps even of visual culture in general. As in Hegel's account of fine art overall, so too his account of painting turns on the appropriateness of artistic form to ideational content. A crucial question, therefore, concerns the relation between the form of painting, painting's solicitation of a certain kind of looking or beholding, which could be called devotional or highly attentive, but which is nonetheless neither merely entertaining nor appetitive nor scientific, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the content that's beheld. The basic question is, what content is fit to be beheld, such that what it is gets apprehended by being beheld thusly? What calls just to be looked at, attended to in that way? Of course, almost anything can be looked at, but most things that can be looked at also can call to be touched or picked up or tasted or smelled or listened to or regarded warily and so on. So lots of narrowing down is going to be required. Hegel wants to raise the question of painting from this very general consideration to a different level of abstraction. For Hegel, the spiritual need, Notwendigkeit, to which painting responds is connected to another quite enormous question. What is looking for? That is, in order to understand the fine art of painting, we have to understand something like the following question. What is the geistige need for this devotional form of beholding? What calls for it? It's useful to recall some basic points Hegel makes in this regard. First, Hegel distinguishes the spiritual need for beholding, under discussion here, from what he calls the poorest mode of apprehension, the least adequate to the spirit, namely merely looking on, as in hours of spiritual fatigue, like sitting back at the end of the day and putting on the TV, something like this. So Hegel makes this first distinction and puts that to one side. The second distinction Hegel makes is that he distinguishes this particular kind of beholding that's at work in painting from desirous looking, from appetitive looking. In appetitive looking, the aim is to cancel the independence and freedom of external things to show that they're only there to be destroyed and consumed. That's Hegel on page 36. Third, Hegel notes how the kind of seeing which lets individual things alone, so which is neither tired looking on nor appetitive looking, is theoretical apprehension, the purely theoretical relation to the intelligence. Hegel calls this the work of science, in which intelligence goes straight for the universal, the law, the thought, and concept of the object, on page 37. So that's a third distinction. However, artistic interest, as a kind of fourth kind of looking, distinguishes itself, just to repeat, from the work of science, from mere amusement, and from appetitive, desirous looking, by virtue of the kind of looking entailed in the making and perceiving of visual artworks. Unlike mere amusement, fine art engages the highest interests. In contrast to desirousness, fine art makes these interests manifest in ways that let the object persist freely, independently. But unlike science, art cherishes this interest in its object as its individual existence and does not struggle to change it into universal thought and concept, end quote. So at the beginning of section 3 now of the paper. These three conditions bear in a special way on the art of painting, insofar as painting, Hegel says, opens the way for the first time to the principle of finite and inherently infinite subjectivity. In paintings, what we see is effective and active in ourselves, end quote. So for Hegel, Christian painting especially makes visible, makes shine, the liveliness of subjectivity as self-relatedness or inwardness, volle Innigkeit. Secondly, painting makes human self-consciousness effectively, compellingly visual in a lively way. So it's not boring, it's effectively engaging. Whatever is theoretically grasped is grasped effectively by the beholder. In fact, as Robert Pippin puts it, I think quite nicely, there's a kind of analogy in Hegel between the relationship that is installed between an artwork and a beholder and a relationship between people, as if the claim made by visual works of art were somehow like the claim made by another person or even just the presence of another person. Third, what's sensuously grasped, the subject matter or the content, is self-related subjectivity, or more broadly, what Hegel calls the human heart, feeling, Innigkeit. And in this regard, Hegel offers a thesis that, to my mind, has not yet received the commentary it deserves because it's such an astonishing thesis, so counterintuitive, I think. Hegel says the paradigm of painterly bliss is the religious love, the passionless love, Leidenschaftlos Liebe, of Mary for her son, Christ. So I'll just read the passage. As the most perfect subject for painting, I've already specified, Hegel says, the love, the object of which is not a purely spiritual beyond, but is present, so that we can see love itself before us in what is loved. The supreme and unique form of this love is Mary's love for the Christ child, the most beautiful sphere to which Christian art in general has risen. So in the paper, I offered a few, 3 examples just to give a kind of sense of the narrative that Hegel wants to give in this regard. As you can see from the Byzantine icon, Theotoktis through Duccio, through Da Vinci, we can see that the Christ child is presented not only as a kind of bearer of legitimacy, as a king whose significance is not independent to Christ, but rather socially determined or naturally determined by virtue of being a small creature, to being beheld lovingly, maternally by Mary in the Da Vinci, and at the same time ceases to be sort of a little man, as in the Byzantine icon of the medieval paintings in particular, and becomes a chubby baby that we know from Raphael or from Da Vinci. But most significant to Hegel is the turn of the gaze. It's what makes the Duccio, for example, so it's such a radical innovation that Mary turns and looks. And in the Da Vinci, this is exaggeratedly the case, we might say. So for Hegel, the inward self-relatedness of Mary is visible in those late Italian paintings, not in the portrait of Mary only, as for example, in Rembrandt or Velázquez's manner of individual portraiture, but rather in the depiction of her looking at her child, especially in Italian painting for Hegel. Moreover, this painterly presentation is not just a mirrored illustration of a practice of parental love that already lies outside painting. Rather, Hegel seems to see the paintings as a matrix for understanding, hence for intervening in the reality of the parental love they depict in the achievement of a modern, we might say, relationship between parents and children. Think of how parents often produce and gaze upon photographs or images of their children, not as mere representations to be dispassionately studied, but with a devotion that's dialectically intertwined with the forms that parental devotion takes, practically, extra-artistically. So it's important to underscore in Hegel's own account that there are ethical, extra-artistic, also religious stakes in this. As Hegel points out elsewhere in the Philosophy of Right, mutual subjectivity, we might even say the demands of mutuality as between subjects, überhaupt, cannot flourish in modernity unless parents love their children more than children love their parents, unless there's this flip from the adoration of a transcendent father, as in the iconoclastic tradition, to the inverse, the mother's devotion of the child. And that this devotion has to be lovingly passionless, not merely disinterested, as in Kant, without the expectation that the love be returned in kind from the artwork or from the child. So I asked at the outset, what content is fit to be beheld, such that what it is gets apprehended by being beheld thusly? That's Hegel's question. What calls just to be looked at, attended to in that way? And how does that answer to that question bear, as it must, on the broader question concerning the intelligibility of the world and ourselves altogether? That's the ambition in Hegel's Science of Art. So you can see that an awful lot hangs on Hegel's answer to this question, namely maternal love, the mother's beholding of the child, and our beholding of that. So let me reconstruct Hegel's account to support the following conclusions. I'm at the end of section 3. First, the spiritual need for looking, for just looking, to which the art of Christian painting is the most adequate response in Hegel's view, concerns not only the theoretical power of seeing in general, but above all the way in which the theoretical power of seeing makes intelligible or apprehensible the free self-related subject, Mary. Second, the self-related subject, Mary, is made apprehensible by the art of painting, by the theoretical deliverances of that practice, that art practice, with its exclusive focus on seeing. Self-related subjectivity, Hegel seems to think, would not be thus apprehensible without the art of painting, without fine art, which is quite a large claim. Third, the art of painting achieves this most fully in the apprehension of the practice of maternal love, since again, Mary's self-relatedness is apprehended in our beholding of her relation to her child, or in our apprehension of what the centuries-long tradition of portraying Mary was able to render intelligible over time, from Theotoktis to Da Vinci, for example. So with these overall points made about Hegel's lectures on fine art, I want to return to the question I posed at the outset. And I want to notice that Hegel's claims concern the way in which Mary looks at Christ, but not the way in which she touches him. For Hegel, there is, so to speak, a wrong or impoverished or diminished or inadequate way for Hegel to behold her son, a way of beholding that would miss or fail to adequately grasp her child's independence. Hence, a way in which her own, Mary's own, self-relatedness would be diminished or stunted or inadequately felt by her. This is, I think, a very elusive point on Hegel's part, and I'm not sure I have an adequate grasp of it myself, to be honest, but at stake seems to be, for Hegel, the way in which our long self-education through art making over time entails a theoretical apprehension of self-relatedness, which is vouchsafed by moral and practical implications. After all, at issue is the treatment, the apprehension and treatment of a child, of children as independent and freestanding, and the corresponding self-relatedness or bliss, as Hegel puts it, of human subjects in general, starting with Mary. So the ethical stakes are embedded in the development of the theoretical power of seeing, a theoretical power which it is art's special task, an exclusive task, to apprehend as part of its practice. Let me switch gears then and refer to a book that you may not know. If you're an art historian, you probably do know it, by Leo Steinberg, that was published in the early 1980s, called The Sexuality of Christ in Renaissance Art and Its Modern Oblivion. In that book, Leo Steinberg thinks he discovers a scandal, as he calls it. The scandal is there are thousands, not just tens or hundreds, but thousands of Christian paintings which focus on an ostentatio genitalium, as Steinberg puts it, comparable to the canonical ostentatio venerum. And what Steinberg does, if you read his book, is he constantly says over and over with lots of examples, look at these paintings. There is a touching and a displaying of the Christ child's genitals in these paintings. And Steinberg thinks that our obliviousness is our obliviousness to this fact. Now, what I want to say by alluding to Steinberg here is not merely to repeat Steinberg's observation. I think it's a true enough observation as an art historian, but I want to take an angle on Steinberg's observation. I want to say that our inattention or obliviousness to the significance of the touching or the significance of the exposure of the child's genitals is not just enabled by critical inattention, as if we missed it, but it's endemic to the form of painting. This is something Steinberg strangely doesn't consider. Because the form of painting does not call for touch or to be touched, and in fact calls not to be touched, the obliviousness to the significance of touching is not only an obliviousness on the part of the beholder, it's essential to the development of the art of painting itself. I think this is something that Steinberg would have learned if he had read Hegel. There's no evidence he did read Hegel, strangely enough. So I've given in the paper, you can look at them, a couple of examples. They're the cover and the back cover of Steinberg's book. And Bellini, of course, is an artist to whom Hegel devotes a fair amount of attention in the Lectures on Fine Art. Now, if my discussion at the outset was not misguided, then the exclusion of touch from the art of painting, on which Hegel insists, means that the theoretical, ethical, practical significance of how we touch each other cannot be adequately apprehended by the art of painting, or indeed by art at all. I cite again the passage from Hegel's Lectures on Fine Art. The sensuous aspect of art is related to the two senses of sight and hearing. The significance of touching and exposure on display in the Christian paintings, which Steinberg traces, is not adequately apprehensible in the form of painting. So I want to argue that understanding the significance of the touching and exposure of the child cannot just be a matter of looking harder or longer at the paintings, or of doing better art historical exegesis, as Steinberg supposes. Indeed, it's precisely this short-sighted view of art's significance against which Hegel wanted to guard. And again, Hegel guards against it when he excludes touch from the purview of art. Which means that, although the significance of touching and exposure on display in Christian painting is not adequately apprehensible in the form of painting, the fact of painting's inadequacy when it comes to apprehending the theoretical significance of touching is on display. So when Hegel speaks of art's exclusion of touching in favor of seeing, Hegel, I think, means to suggest that the theoretical significance of touching can only be limned by the manifest inadequacy of the theoretical power of seeing to grasp it. And it is that inadequacy which is on display in Christian painting, in art's self-limitation to the sphere of the visual. Let me pause here to say that I am well aware that I may be reading into Hegel my own view, and I'm not bothered by that in this context, but I think it's possible to excavate the reading I'm giving from Hotto's lectures, if not from Hyman's. This, I think, tumbles directly into Hegel's thesis on the persistent pastness of art's highest vocation, art as a thing of the past, and vergangenis. If it's part of art's highest vocation to have made sensuously apprehensible our highest concerns, the divine, then it's also part of art's self-limitation that this sensuous apprehension was and remains exclusively visual and acoustic. Now, it's commonly assumed in the secondary literature that by speaking of the pastness of art's highest vocation, Hegel meant to indicate the pastness of a sensuous apprehension of the absolute. Robert Pippin, for example, says this in various places, but that others do as well. It's, I think, almost a truism of contemporary accounts of Hegel's views on the pastness of art. I hope my discussion thus far can serve to show that such an understanding of Hegel's view on the pastness of art is not only limited, but so limited as to amount to a serious misdirection. By excluding taste, touch, and smell from the purview of art, Hegel indicates that at least three sensuous modes of apprehension, three sensuous modes of material embodiment, cannot and have not become past along with art's highest vocation. So my hope is that my preceding discussion has prepared us to consider the following conclusion. Only when art's highest vocation is apprehended as a thing of the past can a chief significance of art's visual character come into view, namely the inadequacy of art when it comes to grasping the moral and theoretical significance of touching and exposure with respect to the highest human concerns. Indeed, if my reflections so far are valid, we can conclude that art's self-limitation might help us to apprehend the limitations of visual culture when it comes to apprehending the stakes of how and with what implications we touch each other. I think it follows from my discussion, or so I'm trying to argue, that art not only excludes touch from its purview, it follows further that art's self-limitation, that artworks cannot adequately apprehend the significance of touching, means that art teaches us how and with what implications the highest concerns are apprehensible in how we touch each other. I can put this point exactly the other way around, via what I'm going to call the pornographication of contemporary visual culture. I'm at the beginning of section 7, the last part of the talk. If artworks, qua visual, were somehow able to teach us how and with what implications our highest concerns are apprehended in touch, then we should be able to say something about what that lesson would look like. Well, maybe it looks like the kind of paintings to which Steinberg draws our attention. I was struck, however, very struck, so struck that I lost sleep for about a month, by an article that appeared in the New York Times in September of 2019 that reported which, and I'm not exaggerating, this is on the New York Times, 45 million images of children being sexually abused circulated online in 1 year, more than double the previous year. So not just the thousands of paintings that Steinberg offers, but an uncountable mess. So let me use this fact to open two questions for discussion. The first is a burgeoning proliferation and circulation of visual depictions of the touching and treatment of children would evince, perhaps, continuing possibilities for art's highest vocation, only if one thinks that the production or beholding of such images can somehow be a sensuous mode of apprehending the divine. I hope I've provided enough evidence to show that, with Hegel's help, this cannot be the case, even though Hegel himself thinks it was the case in Christian painting. And this means I think we have to have some serious reservations even about Hegel's account of Christian painting. I wonder if Hegel offers enough in his lectures on fine art to help us distinguish between the Da Vinci that he likes and the Bellini that's on the cover of Steinberg's book. I personally do not think Hegel offers sufficient resources for considering this distinction sufficiently. In other words, I don't think Hegel is able to give an account adequately of the difference between the profane and the sacred in his account of visual art. But I do think he gives us enough resources in his difference between art's highest vocation, although it might not have been a successful one, and extra artistic vocations to orient us a little with respect to contemporary visual culture. Secondly, it strikes me that those who would defend the idea that art's highest vocation is not past, that it continues in film or in contemporary forms of visual expression. I think not only of Pippin's recent work on film from a Hegelian perspective, but more generally of work like Victor Turner or Stanley Cavell, that treat film as a continuation of art's highest vocation. It seems to me that these kinds of Hegelian-inspired defenses of an ongoing high vocation for visual culture would need especially to give an account of how the depiction of physical treatment of children by adults makes intelligible some content about that treatment, which would legitimate or demand this visual culture. As an example, to provoke discussion, I want to pick a film that has received a lot of adoration from philosophers of all stripes. It's the Dardenne brothers' film, Le Gamin au Vélo, The Kid with a Bike, from 2011. Maybe some of you know this film. It's a film that follows with this sort of documentary handheld camera, a boy who is abandoned by his father, and the camera tries to capture, Robert Pippin argues in an essay from Critical Inquiry, tries to capture the inner life of the child. In other words, he makes an Hegelian argument about the film, that the film is able to capture on the screen visually something about the boy's suffering that would make it intelligible, apprehensible, in a way that it wouldn't be without that film. Pippin may be right descriptively about what the film does, but I don't know if he's right normatively. My question is, why would this content, the psychological experience of a suffering child, demand a visually depicted form? Do we really need to watch what the Dardenne brothers show us in their stylized film in order to apprehend the psychology, the inner life of the boy on display? It seems to me highly questionable to conclude that if I come across a child crying or abusing himself in the wake of having been abandoned by his father, that the first thing I should do is take out my camera and start filming in order to understand better what the child is going through. It seems to me even stranger to conclude that the next thing I should do is go out and hire a young actor to mimetically recreate the scene visually and then film or record that in order to help eventual viewers better understand the boy's psychological state. Is recourse to this visual and acoustic medium of film really what this content demands in order to be made effectively intelligible at all? I hope I've given reasons for thinking that this can't be the case, or at least we should stop and have some serious questions about it before we conclude that it is the case. And I think this raises a very general question about how we adjudicate visual culture broadly. Do we lack scientific criteria of a Hegelian sort for deciding whether visual culture today makes apprehensible our highest concerns? Or do we have to fall back on our critical judgment of particulars? Recall that perhaps the most famous definition of pornography ever given was by Justice Potter Stewart in Ohio, who said, "I know it when I see it," which is a pretty good Kantian answer. So we're right back to where we started, it seems to me, in contemporary visual culture, in Hegel's confrontation with Kant and the deduction on the true concept of art, which leads me to the question I want to conclude with: how satisfied are we with the inheritance of contemporary visual culture and with what it shows about who we think we are? Done.
Thank you very much.
I hope that wasn't too long.
No.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Paul. There are a lot of things that we can discuss about the text you presented, and I suggest to write on the chat if someone want to intervene, and or to show the hand, and I can give the floor.
I mean, I also see that the vast majority of participants have Italian names. And so if you're more comfortable asking in Italian, I'll translate the question for others who speak Italian.
What do you want?
As you
There is a question that is not a question for the discussion of Kiel Björgen about the possibility to read the. Okay, but Luca gave you. Okay, thank you. So, Francesco, please.
So, thank you, Paul, very much for your interesting lecture. I have a lot of questions, but I ask two general things. The first one, on the basis of Hegel's aesthetics and the interpretative model you presented here, where art is closely linked to a practical and moral dimension, to show the divine in moral terms too. In your opinion, can scandalous and even immoral art exist as art from a Hegelian perspective? And the second very general thing is what remain of this way of conceiving painting when painting is no longer figurative but abstract?
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, so there are two questions. I'm going to leave aside the abstract question for a minute. The first question is about the distinction between the sacred and the profane in visual representation, and the extent to which this is a moral and practical distinction at the same time as it's a theoretical distinction, which is my position. I think that Hegel sees these as theoretical and moral at the same time. That is to say, how we apprehend ourselves theoretically is immediately a question of how we live with each other practically. So, but I think that what's most significant about the structure of Hegel's account in the Lectures on Fine Art is that Hegel thinks this is a distinction between sacred and profane, which art doesn't depict, but which art rather achieves. So the most radical part of Hegel's thesis on my reading is not that mothers are out there loving their children and painting just finally represents it well. Rather, there's something in the visual apprehension of mothers holding and presenting children in the history of Christian art that teaches us what it is to love a child. That seems to me Hegel's claim. In other words, he's not giving a history of parenthood. He's giving a history of art, so to speak, philosophical reconstruction of the history of art. And he sees the structure of looking, that kind of beholding in devotional Christian painting, to teach us the content to which it's most appropriate, how we look at children. I think this is an extremely interesting thesis on Hegel's part. So it's as if he thinks the work of painting was to achieve a distinction, make intelligible distinction between our highest concerns, the divinity of human self-relatedness and freedom, and the profane. Now, I have to quickly underline that it's an important defect, not only of Hegel's philosophy of art, but to my mind of all philosophy of art, that there's no theory of the profane, of what counts as the para-artistic or the kitsch. There's no philosophy of art that's good enough that I know of to account for the para-artistic. But Hegel gives us, as it were, half of this when he thinks he's given us the divine. I think that the last few centuries of visual culture, and this is what the end of the paper was arguing, proves Hegel wrong on that point. And I think even Steinberg proves Hegel wrong on that point. I don't think Hegel has the resources to account from within the lectures of fine art for the distinction between the profanity, if you like, of Bellini, or let's just say of child pornography, and what Hegel thinks is the divine. So I don't think Hegel manages, but I do think Hegel manages on a broader scale to say something very important about the pastness of art's highest vocation with respect to what I was calling the self-limitation of the visual. That it can't help us apprehend the implications of how we touch each other, and that is something art teaches us. It teaches us its limitation. Okay? So that's my answer to the first question. On abstraction, I mean, if you don't mind, I'm going to just give a very, very simple answer to the abstraction question rather than get into the weeds on the history of painting. To me, the philosophical attention paid to abstract expressionism and modernist painting as the right way to think about the inheritance of Hegel's philosophy of art is crazy. And limiting and scholastic in the worst sense. Manifestly, the most interesting and important elements of visual culture concern, at the very same time as the rise of abstract expressionism and modernism, photography and film. And so, implicit in the way I've tried to organize the paper was to say, Hegel's probably right that the high vocation for painting ended with Da Vinci and Raphael. That was it. That's as good as it gets. And that what we should really think about is why then, at that moment, did visual culture not end, but explode? Where we're now inundated on Zoom with sights and sounds of all sorts all the time. That's the question. So I think that it's an area of Hegel scholarship that leaves me scratching my head, that everyone thinks the best way to think about the inheritance of Hegel's lectures on fine arts is to talk about Cézanne. That's crazy. It's a professional error.
Are you talking about Danto or
talking about Danto and Michael Fried and Robert Pippin and those are the names that come to mind. I'm thinking of After the Beautiful in particular.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much. There is okay, Giulia La Rocca. Please, Giulia.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. And so your talk pointed out the self-limitation of fine arts that cannot theoretically grasp what is to be touched. My question would look the potentiality of art on the opposite way. I try to explain. Is there something that only art can grasp thanks to its specific character? I mean, it is interested in the object, but let the object exist freely. It is theoretically apprehension, but not affectively. Is there something that can only be grasped this way and not from other way of knowledge?
No.
Thank you.
No, it's a very good question, and Giulia, in a way, it's exactly the right question. So to set up the paper more adequately, I would have to say, where does art succeed in making the divine apprehensible? And Hegel says it's in Greek sculpture, as you probably know if you've read the lectures. So Hegel thinks there's one art that did this, it's Greek sculpture. And the reason has to do with the fitness of form and content. So the way I read the Greek sculpture passage is to say that the form is dead matter. Stone, marble, bronze. And the content is the freedom in appearance of the human body, living. But not living biologically, living freely, standing and throwing a frisbee and, you know, being an athlete. And so Hegel thinks Greek sculpture nails it. That's art. And it's the only art. So painting, but here's the thing, Julia, because Greek sculpture is so successful, it's not, as it were, aware of or able to make explicit its own limitations. So it's not the end of art historically. It's only the advent, I mean, as you know the story, the advent of Christianity that brings to the fore the inadequacy of Greek sculpture with regard to being self-limiting. So, yeah. It's a good question, though. It's a great question. It's one of the most interesting aspects of the lectures on fine art is that Hegel really makes the case that art succeeded. But Hegel doesn't think painting did. I mean, all the modern arts, all the romantic arts are partial. And the best they can do is show their self-limitation.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Other questions? I would like, okay, Davide, please, Davide Mogetta from Milan.
Thank you. I have a question which might go a little off topic. I understand that, but it's a curiosity which I have had for some time. And it draws on the distinction you have made between the arts which have the possibility, so to say, to show the divine, and in that, so to say, draw a demarcation line with the profane. And it is a particular Madonna with the Child, which is in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich. And that Hegel might have seen, as in the lectures on aesthetics, on fine art, he quotes the paintings from Murillo, which are in the Alte Pinakothek. And I think it is a quite interesting, a quite remarkable painting, because it shows that the mother already suffers, so to say, for the death of her child. And there are other Madonnas with the child which are painted that way. Other examples are from Mantegna, for example. And I was wondering if this, so to say, narrative quality which some paintings can reach can be accounted for looking at Hegel's lectures. And I think it is so, but I would like to know your opinion on that point. And I think it has to do with the ability to show the divine, so to say. I would ask you another thing, which deals with the last part of your paper, which I couldn't read before, so it might really miss the point. But I was wondering if your normative, so to say, worry in the last part isn't, so to say, theoretically bound to a separation of content from form, which would be problematic in a Hegelian sense, so to say. It seems to me like Hegel would start from a question on why such a distinction of form and content has happened, is not to ask for what form should or should not be able to be adequate, so to say, for a certain content. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Those are both very good questions. On the Munich painting, I mean, I read over it quickly, but in the paper I mentioned that Hegel emphasizes that Mary's bliss, her self-relatedness, is vouchsafed by depictions that show her grief and her lamentation. So you're quite right about that. And so those paintings that manage to foreshadow the lamentation from within the maternal love are the most interesting from Hegel's point of view, as you point out. That's true. What I want to say, though, is that Hegel's, if I understand the ambition of Hegel's lecture, Hegel wants to say that whatever he claims about Christian painting or any art can't just be a matter of his clever judgment of particular artworks. It has to be something that the practice of painting itself objectively achieves. I mean, that's his critique of Kant. It can't just be a matter of subjective judgment. And so I suppose I'd answer your first question by saying, I would probably agree as a subjective judger of those paintings that they do a better job than the Bellini on the cover of Steinberg's book. But Hegel wants to have a much stronger claim. He wants to say that there's an objective fact in the history of art, the existence of these paintings, which goes deeper than my subjective judgment of whether or not something is made intelligible, that undergirds his entire thesis. And it's that larger ambition I'm raising questions about with respect to Christian painting. So that's your first question. The second question about content and form. You're absolutely right to say that Hegel would want to know how and with what implications content and form come apart. He thinks that's all of Romantic art. So you could say that Romantic art manages to maintain a high vocation so long as it can say something about how form and content don't fit. That's the self-limitation that I was referring to earlier. And I take it that Hegel wants to say at a certain point in the history of painting, right around Dutch still lives, in Hegel's view, art's ability to self-limitationally show how form and content are coming apart fails, comes up short, loses its high vocation. Are you with me, Davide? And this means, I think it's interesting, it means that the pastness of art's highest vocation for contemporary visual culture means we no longer know how and with what implications form and content have come apart. I think that's a very good way to talk about film culture. You know, what does it mean that anything could be a content for that form? Digital media make this even more perspicuous in my view, since it's the flattening out of medium. So it hinders, I'm suggesting, visual culture nowadays hinders the apprehension of what the coming apart in form and content mean. So I think it's a mistake to treat contemporary visual culture the way Hegel treats the history of fine art. Does that answer your question directly?
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think I forgot to say it was Filippino Lip. Anyway.
Right. So I see Arash has a hand up.
Yeah, many thanks for your talk. Very interesting. So I have just a short question. Is the externality of touch to paint, is it the case that touch is only external to painting, or it is for Hegel, touch is external to any form of art? I mean,
any form of art.
So I mean, I don't know. I mean, perhaps one can somehow argue for perhaps in architecture or sculpture that there has some kind of role. So he's just, I mean, he categorically denies that that touch has any artist that can be in principle, even in future, like new forms of art can in principle be subject of art.
Yep, the answer is yes. So when I teach the lectures on fine art, students always hate that part. They say, what about food? You know, delicious pasta or sushi is wonderful. Doesn't food count? And they always say, what about architecture? Or what about smooth buildings and so forth? And I take it Hegel wants to say, he doesn't want to deny the obvious. Of course, you can touch buildings, you can touch sculpture. And there are passages in Hegel's lectures where he even gives tactile descriptions. For example, when he talks about the coldness of Greek sculpture. It's not clear to me he means only the coldness of the heart. They're also cold looking. They don't look very warm. And that's a tactile feature. But nevertheless, the core of Hegel's claim is that anything to do with the senses that do not leave objects in their free independence, that therefore tarry with the destruction of matter, taste, touch, and smell, can't have to do with art. You know, that's definitely central to Hegel's thesis. The question is, why is it central? To me, that's the more interesting question. Why is it central? So in Hyman, it's central because there are these theoretical senses and there are these practical senses. But I think that's sort of boring. I also think it's false. So I think it's ridiculous to say that there's no theoretical dimension to taste, or to, as Gabriele's book on wine would tell you. So I think it's false, and therefore the Hyman lectures seem to me much less interesting. The Hotto lectures, however, make the real point about art, not about the senses. It's art's exclusive task to show us that seeing alone can't teach us what touching means. That's interesting.
I mean, sorry, just a short. At least I don't remember if this Hegel said or Schelling in another of his work. It's not about art. When he talks about touch, maybe it's Schelling. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah, the other place to look could be Hegel on touch.
Yeah, so there is a kind of dialectical interrelation. So I mean, because there is on the one side that one, the person who is touching something, and the other side that something is touched, and then the interrelation is much more tight than just seeing. So one could think that because there's dialectic in Hegel, perhaps he could have something about touch. But thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
There was Luca that has a follow-up.
Yeah, a quick follow-up on this. Well, first of all, thanks for the great talk. I have many questions, but just on this one, about a clarification about the reason why touch cannot be an essential feature for art and artworks. One of the things that you say in the paper is that what is definitional of art is this kind of particular relation between spectator and the work of art that you define as passionless devotion to what is beheld, which cannot be attained in a touching relation. So I was wondering, is this true? So cannot we have a passionless devotion to what is touched? Is it possible? Or in saying this, we already have a particular inflated, if you want, notion of touch.
Yes.
So a notion of touch that involves something like desire. And so touch and desire go together, but they don't need to go together. Yeah. So I was wondering, well, what you think of this and how you position Hegel in that context.
Yeah, no, thank you. Can I answer positioning Hegel and then positioning myself, since they're different?
Yeah.
Hegel thinks the answer is no. So you can't have I mean, there's nowhere I can see in Hegel where he offers an account of what's properly a sensuous apprehension of the absolute in touch. This is absent in Hegel's philosophy. However, I would say yes, and I would give a very specific example, and that's touching the dead. So in my book on love, in fact, one of the central aims of the book on love was to show that the way that we touch and treat each other, including the dead, is a sensuous apprehension of the absolute, and we call it love. Love of the dead, love of the living, family love, sexual love. But that's me, not Hegel. And I don't think Hegel gives us resources for that.
Thank you, Paul.
So what I'm trying to do in this paper, Luca, is to see where Hegel's failure to give us resources about what's theoretical in touch might nevertheless generate a way to diagnose contemporary visual cultures, let's call it ethical and theoretical presentation of how we touch each other, basically pornography.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have two questions from Alberto and then Laura. Alberto Siani.
Yes, so thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Paul. As usual, a very, thought-provoking and stimulating talk. And I hope to read also the final and written version of it as soon as it's out. So just one question. I mean, I would have many, but just about this, about what Hegel calls the objective humor. I think you just mentioned the Dutch painting and so on. And I would like to understand what you think about that, because first of all, it's very interesting that it's a very late, for Hegel, it's a very late form of art, but it's one of the few late forms of art which he truly appreciates, of painting especially, that we can really, well, I mean, mostly in the lectures on aesthetics or on fine art, he presents it as the now, first of all, there is a subjective side of skill, obviously, but there is also an objective side. He speaks of the appearance of the objects, of the light, which allows us. Now, it also has a lot to do with touching. It speaks of the light that identifies different ordinary objects in such a way that we feel as if we could almost touch them. So he speaks of the fullness of life, comfort, contentment. It's the realm of the profane, of course, the bourgeoisie and so on, being comfortable with your, daily life, work hard, play hard, and so on. But so in a sense, my question is also, I mean, I'm thinking also about, I don't remember which manuscript, but he also talks about the beggar boys by Murillo, I think, eating the melons, or I don't know, something like that. And he even speaks of a romantic ideal in connection with it, this idea of carelessness and at the same time enjoyment of the ordinary, of the poor ordinary things. And so my question is, starting with this, of course, what you say showed us very well how for Hegel the painting and art in general has become inadequate to present us with the divine and so on. But maybe just because of that, it becomes fundamental in teaching us something else. Now, you were talking about the mother presenting the child and so on. But in what, Danto, I'm sorry again, but he would call the transfiguration of the ordinary, of the commonplace and so on. This is also an achievement, right? And I was wondering whether you may think that it may offer us a key to the contemporary, to what you call the contemporary explosion of the visual. Of course, in a very ambiguous sense, in a way that this transfiguration of the ordinary life, which begins already for Hegel with the Dutch painting, can lead on the one hand to a fuller, appreciation, comfort, contentment, awareness, and even maybe criticism of our daily reality. But on the other hand, it also leads us to an obsession with it, to a fetishism that in the end leads to detachment, cynicism. Now we are able to watch more or less anything without being shocked, pornography, and so on. So that's how would you see this, let's say, line between a positive side of painting? For me, it's positive, but I mean, I'm curious to hear what you think, and this and the visual in our contemporary culture. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Alberto. It's a very large question. So it sounds like you want me to give, you want me to use Hegel's remarks on Dutch painting to begin a narrative of the last 4 centuries of visual culture, and I don't think I can do that. But I can pick up, I think, 2 things in what you said that I think are true that would be a helpful place to start. The first is what Hegel says, as you point out, about the skill of the Dutch painters. That Hegel thinks, I read those passages as we say in English, as a left-handed compliment. The way you look at a painting and you say, wow, very skillful. It's not entirely praise. In other words, there's something about the way in which technique, and this goes back to Davide's question, the way in which formal innovation, has no clear idea of what it's supposed to make intelligible. Is it fruit? Is it an oyster? I mean, oysters are my favorite example. It's not something Hegel talks about, but if you know that if you look at any Dutch painter, they've always got an oyster somewhere because that shows how good they can paint. Do I really need to see oysters? I can't imagine anything less. I can't imagine Hegel finding anything less interesting on earth than an oyster. So there's a problem here, namely that the technical innovation is at the same time a losing of the content. Now, you could put a positive spin on this and you could say, oh, it's the ordinary. Now we love brick walls in De Hoek. And they show us that we're at home on earth. And there's as you say, the comfort and the bourgeois life and the satisfaction of living here without the transcendent, without religion, all these things. But I take it that Hegel thinks, I mean, I would reconstruct it to say, I don't know what Hegel thinks about this, but I would reconstruct it to say the moment you have technical innovation without end, without a point, that would be the same way of saying without an end, technical innovation without a point, that because it has no point can take up anything, you're on your way to the pornographic. That would be a good definition of pornography.
I fully agree with that, you know, Paul. That was exactly my lead.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thank you. Laura?
Thank you very much for your talk, Professor Kottman. I'd like to ask you something that what you hint at in your paper, but it's not coming out. And it's the dimension between anthropology and aesthetics that in some way comes out in your paper about the dimension of seeing and touching. And I was wondering if you can maybe go back to this point and say something about if we can find within the anthropology of Hegel some aspects that could be fruitful for understand maybe this aesthetic dimension of seeing and touching, and so the theoretical by Alberto within the aesthetics. So if you can go back to it, thank you very much.
Yeah. I can try. I mean, I think those passages in Hegel's Anthropology where he talks about seeing are, to my mind, and I'm open to being corrected on this because I haven't studied them as carefully as I should to back up what I'm about to say. But it seems to me that what Hegel is doing is giving a very refined way of thinking about a distinction that's actually deep in philosophy from the start. It's in Plato, for example, the idea that we stand upright and we make ourselves no longer dogs by raising ourselves above smelling and tasting our way through the world or touching our way through the world and seeing. And this is what makes us theoretically apprehending beings. It's what makes us science. And I take it that's what Hegel's getting at. And he's trying, just like in Plato, he's trying to say there's an anthropological explanation for this. It's not the full explanation. It's the subjective explanation, the anthropological explanation. That we have this body that stands above the earth and sees. And that's an anthropological fact which has some explanatory payoff. But I think Hegel's difference to Plato and Aristotle, and this is why I was mentioning Plato and Aristotle at the beginning of the paper. Hegel's difference to Plato and Aristotle is he thinks that's only an account subjectively. It's not an absolute account. That the absolute way of understanding seeing is in art. Because art's a dimension of absolute spirit, right? And anthropology is just subjective spirit in Hegel's scheme. Does that answer your question, Laura?
Yes, thank you. And instead for touching, there's no element because, okay.
Well, so there is an account of touch in Hegel's anthropology, but Hegel, I mean, as I was responding to, I think it was Luca Corti, that Hegel, in my opinion, does not have an account of how touch is a sensuous apprehension of the absolute. I don't think any philosopher does. That was what I was trying to do in my love book.
Thank you, Paul. I have a question, if I can, before Luca Corti. And my question is about the notion of pornography. I don't know where I've read it. I read elsewhere that perhaps the first who used the notion of pornography, or who brought the notion of pornography into a cultural dimension, was Rétif de la Breton. So in an Enlightenment atmosphere. And in this sense, I was thinking if it is correct to speak about pornography with reference to these wonderful copulations drawn in Pompeii, or in Chinese representations and so on. Yeah. Can we speak with this reference about pornography? I have this idea, but I can't explain now that the notion of pornography has sense only with reference to Christianity. Out of Christianity, there is no sense for pornography.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, Luca. So I have to improvise an answer that goes beyond the scope of the paper, but which is part of a paper I'll give tomorrow. So the improv is, but you're quite right that, you're absolutely right, that the history of the term, in fact, of course, the name from pornos, prostitute, and graphane, writing, means, as an ancient pedigree that is, let's say, Greco-Roman Christian. You're absolutely right about that. But I think that what's happening in the contemporary visual culture is no longer adequately conceptualized by that history. And I think this is what makes that definition that the Supreme Court Justice gave in the 60s, I know it when I see it, so interesting, is that he said the question of the obscene, which is the Christian question, no longer adequately conceptualizes the pornographic. So I don't know if you have this distinction in Italian, I haven't ever heard it, but in English, we nowadays speak of food porn and real estate porn, where people look longingly at each other's houses and dinner at a restaurant. And there can even be revenge food porn, where you write a bad restaurant review or something. So the concept of pornography, it seems to me, has no longer is no longer graspable within the context of the obscene or the Christian inheritance, and instead speaks to what I would call particulars without end, which is what Alberto was getting at, I think, in his question about the breaking of form and content, that if we now have a technical form that can present anything, then really what that anything has to be is particulars without end, that can only solicit our judgment, our attention, our appetite, our instinct, and that's it. So with no divine moment in Hegel's sense, no moment of apprehension that would allow us insight into anything else. It would be stupefying.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, Luca Corti.
Yeah, I do have, it's more than a question, it's a remark or a comment that comes from my work on Hegel's anthropology. And I've been trying to understand Hegel's treatment of the various senses in the anthropology, which is usually taken, so the standard view is like sight is the best of the senses, and touch is the worst of them. But I don't think it's totally correct, that reconstruction in the even in the anthropology. And the reason why, if you look at the anthropology, Hegel can be quite critical of sight. And the reasons why he is quite critical might be maybe of interest for you. And they come from the debates of the time on touch, which became quite central. So the topic of touch, both in literature, but also in the anthropology, for two reasons. First of all, that was the moment when the surgery to the cataracts was introduced in 1760, I think. And so they were able to cure the blindsided, and the reflection on the blind started most notably with the Diderot letter to the blindsided, Lettre to the aveugle. And in that work, Diderot makes some consideration that resonate in some sense, and I find some of them in what you've said. One of the protagonists is a mathematician, and the mathematician claims that he can see, a blind mathematician, so cannot see, and he claimed that he can see the universe more rationally because it's not distracted by the aesthetically beautiful, by aesthetical delight. And so aesthetic and vision, vision and aesthetics understood in terms of vision works against rationality. So, and from there, Diderot tries to revert the classical hierarchy of the senses and says that touch is more important. Also, because in touch, inside you see only the surface of the object and not the whole object. It's such bi-dimensional. And all these arguments are taken up by Herder, he had some sight problem. I don't remember which one, but he had some problem. He couldn't see from one eye. He went to Goethe to ask for ways to solve this problem. And his essays on plastic, he uses the same arguments. He refers back to Diderot saying almost the same thing, namely that vision sometimes obstructs our access to the rational. And he then links Schauen with Schönheit, so sight with beauty, but more in a negative way than in a positive way, so to speak.
Right. Oh, that's great.
So and Hegel takes up some of these ideas, even in the anthropology, when he talks about sight. Of course, he says, yes, it's the noblest of the senses, but it has limitations, and these limitations are the same kind of limitations that Herder was pointing to, that Diderot was pointing to, that to some extent you were pointing to in your
That's very helpful.
So just a comment, but I thought your paper helped me to understand reversely some things that I have read in the anthropology.
It's very helpful, Luca. Thank you. I don't know the Diderot, but I do know the Herder, and I think you're right. If I can just finish the remark you just gave and say that it's indeed a limitation for Hegel in the aesthetics that sight is about beauty. And that we don't have an equivalent in touch and taste is interesting. We don't say when we touch someone how beautiful, we say it feels good or something, a pleasure. And in food, likewise, we don't say the beautiful, we say the good. And so there's, you're right that I think Hegel's intuition, even in the anthropology, I agree with you, is that sight's privilege is a limitation. Yeah. And what's interesting to me is it's a limitation that concerns art. Yeah. And I think helps us understand Hegel's claim about art's pastness.
Yeah, but what I want to say is the anthropology is not contradicting your claim in a sense.
No, I got it. Yeah. No, you're right. And I'll definitely look at the Diderot. That's very helpful. Thank you. I've written it down.
Other questions or remarks or observations or what do you want? Okay.
Thank you so much. I
Paul,
appreciate the
thank you very
discussion
much.
Thank you.
and the
Thank you.
questions. Yeah, thank you.
It was really a pleasure. È
No.
stato bellissimo averti qui e vederti.
Grazie, grazie. Anche a me.
Il lutto di vederti.
Speriamo non sia...
Vogliamo
Sì, speriamo non sia tanto
toccarti, non solo vederti.
Esatto. Ci abbracciamo. Una cosa strana su Zoom è che non si può guardare l'altra persona negli occhi. Quindi una visione storta, non c'è reciprocità.
Vero, vero.
Un abbraccio, grazie mille. Ciao.
Grazie mille.
Grazie Paul, ciao.
Ciao, grazie a tutti. Thank you everyone.
Thank you.